"You're in the wrong seat, sir. This section is for premium passengers only." The voice cut through the cabin like a blade, calm, cold, and unmistakably dismissive. Ethan Royce looked up from his phone, slowly, as if this wasn't the first time someone had mistaken him for less than he was. He was dressed simply grey hoodie, well-worn jeans, a pair of everyday sneakers. A leather briefcase sat at his feet. He didn't look important. He didn't look like a man who could shift the ground under someone's feet. The flight attendant, a tall woman in a tight bun and sharper tone her name tag read, Susan Green, was already tapping on her tablet, fingers drumming with impatience. "Did you hear me?" she repeated. "You need to move. You're not supposed to be here." Ethan tilted his head slightly and held up his boarding pass. "Seat 1A, first class." Susan didn't even glance at it. "Let me see your ID." Around them, murmurs were already rising. A teenage boy in row 3 had pulled out his phone. A middle-aged woman in business attire glanced up from her laptop and started recording. A man across the aisle whispered, "Here we go again." Ethan handed her the ID. His expression never changed. He'd done this dance before, just not on a stage with this many spectators. Susan frowned, then tapped her screen again. That has to be a mistake," she said under her breath, but loud enough for others to hear. "Looks like you booked an economy seat." "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago," Ethan replied calmly, showing her his digital boarding pass, the one clearly marked first class, 1AS. Another flight attendant walked over, a younger blonde named Tina, trying to appear helpful but clearly aligning with Susan. "Issue?" "Passenger claims he's in the right seat," Susan said, her tone making it sound like Ethan had committed a crime, not just sat down. "I am in the right seat," Ethan said. Behind him, a white man in seat 2B leaned forward. "Son, maybe you just take your coach seat. No need to hold things up." Susan gave a small smile, as if finally someone spoke sense. "Exactly. Mistakes happen when you're not familiar with the booking process." A pause. Ethan opened his briefcase and placed something silently on the tray table. A sleek, platinum loyalty card, Skylink Elite, 340,000 miles flown. "I've had platinum status for 6 years, he said simply. Susan scoffed. "Anyone can get those online nowadays." She turned to Tina. "Let's call security." At that moment, Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply pulled out his phone and began recording. "For the record," he said clearly, "this is Ethan Royce, flight 208. Seat 1AD denied my paid seat despite valid documentation." Susan's face flushed. The cabin fell into a tense hush. Phones were out. Eyes were on them. Some leaned in, not out of concern, but curiosity. Because drama, when it doesn't affect you, can be entertainment. But for Ethan, this wasn't new. And it wasn't entertainment. This was personal. 30 minutes earlier, Ethan had been seated at gate 17, sipping coffee, scrolling quietly through his company's quarterly reports. The airline staff hadn't given him a second glance. He didn't look like a man who owned 25% of their airline. Because that's how Ethan liked it. Low profile, high impact. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear tailored suits or carry titanium luggage. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But that didn't mean he was blind to how the world worked. He'd grown up in Detroit, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and reminded him every day, "They'll see your skin before they see your soul, so make sure your work always speaks louder than both." And he had. From public school scholarship to MIT. From startup genius to industrial giant. From kid from the block to CEO of Royce Dynamics, a multi-sector firm that quietly bought influence, stock, and infrastructure-owned strategic acquisition at a time. And 3 months ago, Ethan had finalized one of his quietest, most impactful deals yet. He had acquired 22.8% of Skylink Airways, the very airline now telling him he didn't belong in seat 1A. Back in the cabin, tension climbed like pressure in a sealed tank. Susan tapped her earpiece. "Gate security is on the way." A middle-aged man in row 4 cleared his throat. He showed his ID and his pass. "Why not just scan it again?" "Sir, please stay out of it," Susan snapped. Ethan stayed seated, back straight. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't raising his voice. He was just there. A wall of calm, in a room of rising heat. His phone buzzed, a text from his assistant. "Board is prepped. Video call ready. You want to proceed?" He looked down. Then slowly, he stood up. Not to leave, but to make space for what came next. Two uniformed security officers appeared at the front of the aircraft, just as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. The lead officer, a veteran named Mike Bennett, wore the calm demeanor of someone who had seen it all, but the moment he stepped into the cabin and caught the tension, he paused. Eyes were on him. Phones were out. The air was thick with something heavier than protocol. "What's the issue?" Bennett asked quietly. Susan Green stepped forward confidently. "Passenger is refusing to move from a seat he didn't purchase." Bennett nodded, walking over to Ethan, who stood calmly by his seat. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass and ID?" Ethan handed them over without a word. Bennett examined the documents carefully. The pass was digital, time-stamped, verified through the airline's own system. The ID matched. So did the name on the Skylink Elite card, with over 300,000 miles logged. "This all checks out," Bennett said aloud, his voice even. "First-class seat, 1A, paid ticket, verified ID." Susan stiffened beside him. "Well, it can't be right. I'm telling you, this man didn't book this class." Bennett looked at her with a quiet frown. "Ma'am, this came from your system." But Susan wasn't backing down. She leaned in and muttered, just low enough for nearby passengers to hear, "These people, they know how to game the system." The words hung in the air like toxic fog. Ethan didn't react, not with anger, but his jaw flexed once. His fingers tightened ever so slightly around the leather handle of his briefcase. The woman too rose back, a black woman in scrubs, visibly upset, stood up. "Excuse me," she said. "He showed his pass. Why is this still happening?" Susan turned toward her. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. This is a security matter." "No," the woman said, louder this time. "This is a discrimination matter." Another voice joined from row 4. A man in a blazer. "I saw everything. He wasn't aggressive. He showed proof. She just never believed him." In the aisle, Ethan gently raised his hand, signaling silence. He pulled out his phone, typed a message, and pressed call. The conversation was brief, just 4 words. "Let's begin. Full board." 10 feet away, at gate 17, Janet Miles, the ground supervisor, arrived in a hurry. She was good at her job, 12 years with Skylink. Worked her way up from baggage handler. She had seen her fair share of passenger incidents, but never one quite like this. "What's the delay?" she asked Officer Bennett. He handed her the documents without a word. She scanned them quickly. Boarding pass, Idaho, status card. Everything was in order. She looked up at Ethan, confused. "Sir, I'm not sure what's going on, but our crew is requesting you be reseated in coach. It would help us stay on schedule." Ethan's voice was calm but pointed. "On what grounds am I being reseated?" Janet's jaw tensed. "You were confrontational with the crew." "I was sitting quietly. I showed documentation." "That's not confrontation. That's proof." "I'm giving you 2 options," she replied, her voice tightening. "Accept a seat in coach or take the next flight." Behind her, more passengers were standing now. A teenager live streaming on TikTok, a man narrating on LinkedIn, a woman tweeting every moment under the trending hashtag. Number, Skylink discrimination. The flight, originally scheduled to depart 5 minutes ago, was now delayed 17 minutes, but it wasn't going anywhere. Not until this was resolved. Ethan turned to Janet, unbothered. "I'd like to speak with your district manager." Janet actually laughed. "Sir, I'm the highest-ranking staff on duty." "I understand," Ethan replied. "But I'm requesting escalation. Please contact your regional office." "That's not how this works." "Actually," Ethan said, reaching into his briefcase, "it is today." He pulled out a black leather card case, selected one, and handed it to her. Janet read it, then read it again. Her face drained of color. "Ethan Royce, Chief Executive Officer, Royce Dynamics Group, Principal Shareholder, Skylink Airways, 22.8%. For several seconds, the only sound was the whirring of a nearby jet on the tarmac. Then, from behind Janet, came the whisper, "Oh my God." The woman in scrubs leaned over the aisle to get a better look. A businessman from row 3 immediately began Googling. "Holy hell," he muttered. "He's not just a CEO, he owns the airline." Ethan stood there quietly, letting the weight of it settle. Janet looked at her tablet, then at the card, then at Ethan. "This doesn't change the fact you were being disruptive," she said weakly. "No," Ethan said, voice still steady. "This highlights the exact reason I was treated that way." He looked around at the crowd of passengers now gathered near the gate. "Because I didn't look the part." Then his phone buzzed again. A message flashed briefly on the screen. "Boardroom conference call. All executives present, awaiting your lead. He turned to Janet, who was still processing what she held in her hand. In about 2 minutes, he said quietly. You'll receive a call from Skylink's corporate office. I suggest you answer it. Janet blinked. From who? The board of directors. At that moment, Captain Jonathan Marks stepped out of the cockpit, clearly irritated. What's going on out here? We're already late. Janet turned to him, voice still shaky. Captain, this is Mr. Ethan Royce, the passenger in question. He's not just a passenger, he's one of the company's primary investors. Captain Marks looked Ethan up and down, hoodie, jeans, sneakers, then back at Janet. No way, he whispered. Yes way, said the businessman behind him. You might want to start listening. Right on cue, Janet's radio crackled. Supervisor Miles, priority message from CEO Patricia Langston. Please respond immediately. She looked at Ethan. His voice softened, but it held more command than any shout could carry. Let's take this conversation somewhere private, because what I'm about to show you is going to change how you run this airline. Inside the small conference room adjacent to Gate 17, the air had turned electric. Phones buzzed with breaking notifications, and multiple passengers continued to live stream from just outside the glass wall, their cameras peeking in like it was a courtroom drama. Janet Miles was seated stiffly, flanked by Captain Jonathan Marks and flight attendant Susan Green, who now seemed far less confident. Ethan Royce stood across from them, briefcase open, documents spread out like blueprints for an empire. His voice was calm, controlled, almost too calm. Before we proceed, he said, tapping the screen of his tablet, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. He turned the screen toward them. A certificate. Royce Dynamics. Acquisition of 22.8%. Skylink Airways equity stake. Transaction finalized. 3 months ago. Current status. Second largest shareholder. Captain Marks looked like someone had slapped him. This can't be right. I would have heard. You've been a solid pilot for 15 years, Ethan said, not unkindly. I've read your personnel file. Excellent safety record. But your understanding of shareholder communications is less impressive. Janet blinked. You read his file? We review key personnel for all companies we invest in. Standard diligence. Susan shifted in her chair. Her voice, usually sharp, was barely audible now. So, you're saying you own part of us? Ethan looked at her. Susan, I don't just own part of this airline. My company books over 900 flights per year with Skylink. Annual travel budget, $1.2 million, just from us. He paused. And as of this moment, all future bookings are under review. Susan paled. Janet tried to speak, but her radio crackled first. Supervisor Miles, CEO Langston, priority channel, putting her through. The voice that filled the room next was calm but sharp. Janet, is Mr. Royce with you? Janet glanced at Ethan, then replied, Yes, ma'am. Put him on. Ethan stepped closer and spoke with casual clarity. Hello, Patricia. Ethan, the CEO of Skylink replied, her voice clipped and tense. Please tell me this is a misunderstanding. I'm afraid not. And the video footage? Already trending. 4,000 live viewers. I'd say the story's out. Patricia exhaled sharply. Jesus. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This wasn't just a customer service issue. It was a systemic failure. I was dismissed, judged, and removed because of how I looked, not because of what I presented. Your staff didn't verify facts. They made assumptions. There was silence. Then, Ethan, what do you need? Ethan looked around the room. He didn't answer immediately. Because this wasn't about demands. It was about direction. For starters, he said, immediate termination of all staff involved in discriminatory behavior. That includes flight crew and supervisory staff who failed to act appropriately. Second, a third-party managed bias reporting system. Third, mandatory bias and inclusion training within 30 days. He paused, then added, and fourth, a public apology from Skylink. Not just to me, to every customer who's ever been treated as less than. Captain Marks looked like he wanted to disappear. Susan had already turned away, as if avoiding eye contact might undo the past 45 minutes. Patricia's voice came through again. You'll have it, all of it. But, Ethan added, there's one more condition. Janet looked up. I want real-time accountability. Not next quarter. Not a future memo. Starting today, 20% of executive bonuses will be tied to measurable diversity outcomes. Monitored. Reported. Publicly. Patricia hesitated. Ethan, that's going to be a hard sell to the board. He raised an eyebrow. Would it be harder than your stock dropping 2.3% in the last hour? Or harder than tomorrow's headlines reading, CEO refuses reform after racial scandal? Another long pause. Then, agreed. Outside the glass wall, passengers clapped. Live stream chats exploded in emojis and disbelief. Inside, Susan finally spoke, voice breaking. Mr. Royce, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. That's the problem. You didn't even try. 20 minutes later, the gate area had been transformed. Susan Green was being escorted away by security. Captain Marks was grounded, pending internal review. A new crew had been assigned to Flight 208. And Ethan Royce stood near the podium, re-zipping his briefcase as dozens of passengers watched. But one voice broke through the silence. The woman from earlier, the one in scrubs, stepped forward. Mr. Royce, she said, you didn't just speak for yourself today. He turned to her. You spoke for people like me, who don't have titles or shareholders. Just hope that someone, someday, would call it out. Ethan offered a small smile. Then let today be that day. A man recording on his phone whispered. He didn't flip tables. He flipped the system. And Ethan? He simply turned, adjusted his hoodie, and boarded the aircraft. Seat 1A, where he had always belonged. The flight departed 57 minutes late, but no one on board seemed to mind anymore, because something bigger had taken off before the plane ever left the ground. As the aircraft ascended into the clouds, Ethan Royce sat quietly in seat 1A. His phone buzzed with message after message, some from journalists, some from fellow executives, and others. From people he had never met, who simply wrote things like, "Thank you for standing up. You proved we're not invisible." That was more than a flight, that was a movement. But Ethan wasn't smiling. Not yet. Not until the system changed for real. 2 days later, in a glass-walled boardroom at Royce Dynamics, Ethan sat at the head of the table with his assistant, Maya Tran, arranging a series of folders on polished wood. Terminations confirmed, she said. Susan Green and Captain Marks both dismissed. Janet Miles demoted and placed in retraining. Ethan nodded, flipping through documents without reaction. The bias training rollout? He asked. Underway. First 4,000 employees scheduled within the next 30 days. They're fast-tracking it. Even union support is strong. And the reporting system? Live. Third-party verified. Anonymous. We've already had 7 internal reports submitted in 24 hours. Good. That was the real win. Not the headlines, not the trending hashtags, not even the rising stock price. The structure was changing. And that meant it wouldn't depend on a man like him showing up with shareholder power to be treated like a human being. That meant it could work for everyone. By the end of the week, Skylink CEO Patricia Langston appeared on CNBC in a special segment titled, "From Crisis to Change, Inside a Corporate Reckoning." She didn't deflect. She didn't spin it. She said, "Live on national television. Mr. Ethan Royce showed us that change isn't just a moral necessity, it's a business imperative. We failed him, but in doing so, we've learned how not to fail others again." She unveiled a new company initiative. Dignity in the Skies, a set of internal reforms, public commitments, and performance-linked accountability metrics. The clip went viral. By the end of the day, 5 other airlines had reached out to license Skylink's training model developed under Ethan's guidance. The Royce Foundation funded the rollout for free, asking only one thing in return: make it real, not performative. A week later, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. It read, "Mr. Royce, I watched what happened. I'm not a CEO. I'm a 25-year-old black woman who was kicked off a flight last month because they said my ID looked suspicious. I didn't have a phone to record. I didn't have status. But I saw what you did, and I'm not staying quiet anymore. I've joined a coalition documenting racial discrimination in air travel. We're compiling cases. We call it the Royce Report. Nadia B., Chicago." Ethan folded the letter and placed it in a special phylone already growing thick with similar messages, not all dramatic, not all public, but each one a thread in a net-catching injustice where it tried to hide. 3 months later, the Department of Transportation held a press conference. New regulations were announced. Airlines would now be required to log, investigate, and publicly report all discrimination-related complaints. The mandate was called Section Royce, Passenger Equality Standard. When asked why the department used his name, the transportation secretary replied, because he didn't just point to a problem, he built a blueprint to fix it. But maybe the most unexpected moment came 6 months later. Ethan was invited to speak at the National Civil Rights Leadership Forum, held inside the historic Lorraine Motel No, the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. The room was packed, lawmakers, airline executives, educators, activists, and hundreds watching online. Ethan took the podium. No flashy intro, no title slide. Just a story. The one you've now heard. And he ended it like this. They asked me to leave my seat. But the real problem wasn't that I stood up for myself. The real problem was that the system made it so I had to. My goal is simple. That the next passenger who looks like me or doesn't never has to prove they belong before they're treated with dignity. The crowd rose to their feet. But Ethan didn't linger in applause. He stepped off stage and into the crowd, quietly shaking hands, hugging strangers, listening to stories. Because it was never about him. A year later, Susan Greeneath, same flight attendant who once tried to remove him, wrote an op-ed in the Chicago Tribune. She now worked as a consultant in diversity training, traveling across the country teaching others how to recognize and unlearn bias. In her article she wrote, "I was wrong. And because of Mr. Royce, I didn't just get punished. I got a chance to change. And I took it." And finally, back on a familiar plane route flight, 208 to Seattle, Ethan boarded quietly, wearing the same grey hoodie and jeans. The flight attendant, a young black man named Devon, smiled wide as he checked Ethan's pass. "Mr. Royce," he said respectfully, "we're honored to have you aboard." "No special treatment," Ethan replied. "Just treat me like everyone else." "That's exactly the plan, sir." As Ethan took his seat in 1A, he looked around. Business people, students, families, different faces, different stories. But for the first time, he felt like they were all flying equal. The sky hadn't changed, but the system had. And somewhere in that quiet hum of the cabin, Ethan finally smiled.